But in the first 12 verses of chapter 3, Solomon lays down 6 principles for living. And he said, if you will live these 6 principles, you will receive God's blessing. He starts in the first 2 verses by saying, remember God's commands and obey them. When he says keep them, the word means obey. In verses 3 and 4, he says, don't ever let kindness or faithfulness leave you. In other words, Christians are to be kind. Christians are to be dependable. In verses 5 and 6, he says, trust God, not yourself. Don't lean to your own understanding. Put him first in everything. He'll direct your paths. Last week we were in verses 7 and 8, which tells us to develop the fear of the Lord. And we defined the fear of the Lord biblically as obeying God and hating sin. And he said, if you do that, it will bring health and nourishment to you. Now we come to verses 9 and 10, which don't seem to fit into the flow of everything else that he says. And then you realize, that he's talking to us about putting God first in all of our ways, acknowledging him. Don't be wise in our own conceits. And then he says, verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. So he has told us, remember God's commands and keep them. Practice kindness and dependability in your life. Trust God, not yourself. Develop the fear of the Lord. And in verses 9 and 10, he says, give to God first. Honor the Lord with your wealth, the first fruits of all your crops. Your barns will be filled to overflowing. Your vats will brim over with new wine. What we're going to do this morning is look at the definitions of the words in these verses. Then we're going to look at the history of first fruits. What in the world are the first fruits? And then we're going to do a frequently asked questions about giving to God and putting God first in our giving. The definitions of this verse are pretty simple. Honor the Lord is actually a word that has to do with worship. It means to glorify him. It means to boast in him. It's one of the Hebrew words that can be translated as worship. So you hear me when I pray over the offerings, Lord, we're worshiping you with our tithes and offerings. We worship God in song. We worship God through the study of the Word. We worship God in our giving. Then he says, with your wealth. And right away most would say, well, that lets me out because I don't have no wealth. Well, let's just be real here, You're wealthy. Compared to the world, we are exceedingly wealthy. In the 90s, U.S. News and World Report had a rich test. And if you were able to answer yes to any one of these questions, you were at that point in the top 10% of all of the people who have ever lived on the earth. And here were the questions. Remember, if you can answer yes to one of them, you're in the top 10%. Do you own more than one pair of shoes? Can you choose what you will eat today? Do you have your own mode of transportation? Do you have more than one pair of underwear? In the 90s, if you could answer yes to any one of those, you're in the top 10%. More recently, here were the figures. If you made $1,500 last year, you're in the top 20% of the world's income earners. If you have enough food, decent clothes, live in a house or apartment, have a reasonably reliable means of transportation, you're among the top 15% of the world's wealthy. If you earn $25,000 or more, you are in the top 10% of the world's income earners. If you have any money at all saved, a hobby that requires some equipment or supplies, a variety of clothes in your closet, 2 cars in any condition, and live in your own home, you are in the top 5% of the world's wealth. So, yes, we are wealthy. You all have, everybody in here has come to church at least twice, and you've worn something different. So, you are wealthy. So he says, honor the Lord with your wealth, your substance, the King James says, what you have, and with the first fruits. Anybody want to guess what first fruits means? It means first. Of your crops, the King James says of your increase. And he says of all of your crops, all of your increase. And again, after extensive study, that word all means all of it. So that's, you know that. You don't have to take too many studies to understand. It's pretty clear. Honor the Lord with what you have and the first fruits of your increase. And then he says, I'm going to give you a promise. Your barns will be filled overflowing. Your vats will brim over with new wine. And before you say, I'm not there yet, wait till we get there. So let's talk about what first fruits are. Honor the Lord with your first fruits. It really is the first of the fruits. Leviticus chapter 23, verses 10 and 11. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the Lord a sheaf of the first grain that you harvest. If you can get to Deuteronomy 26, why don't you flip there so you can read and see that I'm reading what's really there. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy 26. This is Moses instructing the children of Israel when they get into the promised land. When you have entered the land, verse 1, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, take some of the first fruits of all that you produce from the soil of the land the Lord your God is giving you, put them in a basket, then go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, and take it to the priest, and you say, here, I've come to give you what God has given me. And he said, and then they just kind of rehearsed the history. I was in Egypt, I was a slave, I was set free, God brought me into this land, and now, verse 9, he brought us to this place and gave us this land flowing with milk and honey, and now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Lord, have given me. And then you place the basket before the Lord and you bow before him, and then you will rejoice in the good things God has given to you. So if you catch what he's saying here, he's saying this: you bring the first fruits of the harvest that God has given you. It is a symbol of two things. It is a symbol first of your recognition that it is God who gave this to you. It's not our hands that give us wealth. Anytime that you think you are exempt from life and that your abilities is what gives you your income and your strength is what gives you your income and it's not God, give me a call. I will arrange for you to shadow me for a day or two, and you will understand that it can literally be taken away from you in an instant. It is God that gives us that ability. And when you bring God the first fruits, the first thing you're saying is, God, I acknowledge that everything I have comes from you. And the second thing that they're saying is, and I trust God that there's more to come, because first fruits has with it the idea of more to come. They're saying, I'm bringing God the first fruits because I trust him that he is my provider, and what I need in the future, there's going to be more to come. Now, here's a side sermon in 45 seconds or so. Jesus is called the first fruits of those who sleep, speaking of death. Easter Sunday, the resurrection, is celebrated at the time of the Jewish feast of the first fruits. Jesus is the first fruits of our resurrection. His resurrection is the promise of more to come. His resurrection as the first fruits is the assurance of our resurrection and eternal life. That's sermon number 2. So what happened is this. The farmers in Israel were required to mark their crops to be designated as first fruits. And they went early in the harvest time and they found the grains that were the most progressed, the ones that were the furthest along. And they would literally tie a red yarn around those and say, those are my first fruits. And then when it came time for the harvest, they would take those first fruits, submit them to the priest as an acknowledgement that God had blessed them, that everything comes from him, and that he is going to take care of them. The same thing is true with us. Every time we give God from our first fruits, we are saying, God, everything I have comes from you. I give you back the first fruits because it's what you asked for, but I recognize that everything comes from you. And second, I recognize that you're going to be my provider, and you're going to take care of me. And I give you this as a sign of my faith, that you are my God, and you are going to take care of me. Now, this idea of acknowledging God as our provider starts back in Genesis chapter 14, when Melchizedek, who some think was the pre-incarnate Christ, blessed Abraham, and Abraham brought him a tenth of everything that he had. That's Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. Leviticus chapter 27, starting in verse 30, says this: a tithe of everything from the land. And let me just put a parenthesis here. There have been in the past people that I know who were farmers who would act literally, would tithe their crops, and they would tithe their livestock, and they would actually, they would do their harvest, and they would butcher, the first fruits of their livestock, and they would bring the first fruits of their vegetables and stuff, and they would bring it to the pastor, as their tithe, bring it to the church and say, here's our tithe from this. Pastors who pastor in the country appreciate that. They like, and if you need to tithe filet mignon or anything, I'll give you my address. But and what I'm telling you is there are still people who literally practice that. We do it with our finances, but there are still people who live off the land who tithe, from their crops, who tithe from their livestock and so on. So it goes back to Leviticus. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It's holy to the Lord. Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod will be holy to the Lord. No one may pick out the good from the bad or make any substitution. If anyone does make a substitution, both the animal and its substitute become holy and can't be redeemed. In other words, what would happen is, every tenth belonged to God. But, human nature has been the same from Genesis 3 on. And human nature said, oh no, that 10th one, man, that's the best one I got. Let's make him number 11 and get the scrawny guy from the back and put him number 10 and give the scrawny guy to God. And Moses said, you can't do that. If you do that, both of them belong to God. Let me give you another illustration that might help you understand what they were doing, and it's human nature. Years ago, when it was still safe to walk, in neighborhoods to church, little boy would go to Sunday school. His parents didn't go, but they would let him go, and his mom always gave him 2 nickels. And she said, one of them is for you. After church, you can buy ice cream or something on your way home. This is a long time ago. The other nickel is for God. Put that in the offering. He's going to church one day, and he's kind of fiddling with the money in his hand, and one of the nickels drops and rolls down into the storm sewer. And the little boy stops for a moment and looks up to heaven and says, I'm sorry, God, there went your nickel. That's kind of the way it is, right? And that's what Leviticus 27 is talking about. Deuteronomy 14, verse 22, make sure to set aside a tithe of all that your fields produce each year. And if you're going to talk about this, you have to be honest, go to Malachi chapter 3. Last book of the Old Testament, right before Matthew. Malachi chapter 3. Book of Malachi is a fascinating book. It's basically an argument between the children of Israel and God. It's a series of questions. God says, I'm going to tell you this. And the children of Israel say, huh? What are you talking about? And God says, well, I'm talking about this. And when they get to chapter 3, he starts talking about finances. In verse 8, he says, will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. And he said, what do you mean? How are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, your whole nation, because you're robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. Only time in the Bible where God says, test me. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it, and I will prevent pests from devouring your crops, and the vines in your fields will not drop their fruit before it's ripe, and all the nations will call you blessed, and yours will be a delightful land. Now, when you talk about passages like this, inevitably somebody says, but that's Old Testament. And we're New Testament. We're not under the law, we're under grace. Very true. But if you study the Old Testament and study the New Testament, you will learn rather quickly that the New Testament standard is much higher than the Old Testament standard. The Old Testament standard said if you commit adultery, it's a sin. The New Testament standard says you look in somebody with lust, that's sin. The New Testament standard is much higher. And in fact, they say, well, Jesus didn't say anything about tithing. No, that is incorrect. Matthew 23, Luke chapter 11. Jesus said to the Pharisees, you give a tenth of your spices. And they would do, these little, Donna's got some plants, with the spices and herbs, whatever they're called. Anyway, because my spices are salt and a little bit of pepper. That's what I know about the spices. But they would literally go through those plants, and every 10th leaf they would pick and take it, to God. So he says, you do this, but you've neglected things like justice and mercy and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. King James says, you ought to have done this. In other words, Jesus says, yes, you tithe. Everybody knows you tithe, but that doesn't excuse you from being a person of justice and mercy and faithfulness. So, let's ask a couple of the main questions. Why should I tithe and how should I tithe? Why should I tithe? Well, the Bible teaches it. And by the way, in case you don't know what the word means, the word tithe means 1/10, which is 10%. I can't believe it, but it is true because I heard it with my own ears. I heard a pastor say, we help people who are new to church ease into tithing. We start them out tithing 3%. You can't tithe 3%. Tithe 1/10, 10%. You can't tithe 3%. You can't tithe 5%. You can give 3%. You can't tithe 5%. You're not tithing until you're tithing 10%. It's 1/10, 10%. Tithing predates the law. It predates Moses. It started with Abraham in Genesis chapter 14. And by the way, back to the Old Testament standard and New Testament standard, if you study the Old Testament, you will learn that the Jews had 3 tithes. The tithing situation in the Old Testament equaled 27% of their income. So if you would prefer to live by the Old Testament standard, feel free. We'll take another offering when it's done, and you can add the additional 17%. But Old Testament tithe was 27% because they had 3 of them. Leviticus 27 verse 30, the tithe is the Lord's. Here in Malachi 3, tithing brings the promise of God's blessing. He says back in the Proverbs passage, your barns will be filled, your vats will have plenty of wine in them. Here in Malachi, he says, I'll pour you out a blessing. There won't be room to contain it. That does not mean that you're going to drive a Bugatti or a Lamborghini or live in $1 million mansion. It does mean that God will supply your needs. But he says you won't have room to contain it. How full is your closet? How many of them do you have? Do you have stuff in storage? Do you have an attic full and a garage full and maybe a storage shed full? How many times do you have to go to Goodwill or someplace to get rid of stuff that you have? We think room enough to contain it means, I've got more money than I know what to do with. We all have more than we have room to contain. You just drive up and down any road around here, and there's storage buildings rented by people who don't have room to contain what they've got in their own house. You've got a storage shed out back, or under the garage, or under the house, or in the attic. God blesses us. Let's be real. We've got more than we need. He keeps his promise. Jesus says you ought to tithe. That word is a command. It's not a choice. It's not an option. These you ought to do. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 23, the Living Bible says, the purpose of the tithe is to teach us to put God first. Again, there's the concept of first. The first fruits, the first of what we have. And 1 Corinthians 16 in the New Testament was on the first day of the week. Paul says on the first day of every week, each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. He's not talking about tithe there. He's talking about gifts above the tithe. When you study the scriptures, you learn that God is incredibly fair. You know, there's a fairness to his system. There's a justice to his system. You start with tithe. Everybody tithes the same, 10%. That's the same ratio for everybody. Giving above the tithes is to be proportionate. He says, set it aside in keeping with your income. So you have a multimillionaire and you have a struggling single mom. They both give the first 10% of their income to God. Beyond that, wouldn't it be reasonable to expect that the multimillionaire should give gifts, offerings, significantly more than she does? And so that's the beauty of God's system. The tithe is just everything across the board. I remember, see, y'all got to blame the Lord on this because this is not in my notes, so you just blame the Lord. I remember a story of a preacher visiting one of his guys, and they were doing fundraising. It was one of those churches where they'll come get you. You know, there are churches where they will send you a letter saying you are behind in your giving. And he was saying, you know, I need to talk to you about the fact that you're not tithing. And the preacher said, the guy said, well, preacher, I just can't afford to tithe. And the guy said, but you know, every year except this year you've been faithful in your tithing. And the guy said, well, yeah, but I didn't make as much money back then. He said, when I was only making $10,000, I could give $1,000. You know, that's not so bad. But he said, preacher, this year I'm making $100,000. That means $10,000. I just don't think I can do that. Preacher said, let's pray. He said, dear Lord, when he was making $10,000 a year, he was faithful in tithing. But now that he's making $100,000 a year, he can't afford to tithe. So Lord, I pray that you would take his income back to the level where he can afford to tithe it. Oh no, preacher, oh no. You know, it's just across the board, 10%, and then above that is offerings. So how should you tithe? Malachi 3, verse 10 tells us, bring the tithe into the storehouse. I'm going to give you the answer to the blank first, and then we're going to get there. The answer to the blank is it's the local church. You don't tithe to a television ministry. You don't tithe to a radio ministry. You don't tithe to a Christian ministry. You tithe to your local church. Because he says, bring the tithe to the storehouse. Here's what the storehouse was. 2 Chronicles chapter 31, at the temple, the local church of that day, Hezekiah built rooms at the temple for the storage of the tithe. Now remember, the people then are bringing grains and, you know, animals and things. So they built rooms at the temple for the storage of the tithes. Then when people had need, there was stuff there at the temple to be able to give them their need. They tithed all their produce, they tithed all their grain. And in Nehemiah, which is written about the same time as Malachi, Nehemiah chapter 10 and 13, the people brought their tithes, and it says they brought their tithes to the storehouse. The storehouse was the local temple, was the church. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that your tithes should go anywhere but your local church. Once upon a time, all right, I'm preferencing that, but once upon a time. Once upon a time, I was hungry for a Whopper, so I went to Burger King, and I got my food, and then I said, I'm going to go next door to Chick-fil-A and pay. Because Chick-fil-A is a Christian organization, I support what they do, so I'm going to give my money to Chick-fil-A. And the lady at Burger King was not impressed. She said, no, you can't do that. You pay where you eat. Oh. Yeah, you pay where you eat. Where does your tithe go? Where do you go when you're in trouble? Where do you go for your spiritual support? Where do you go for your spiritual sustenance? The tithe goes to the local church. Your offerings, give wherever the Lord tells you to give. The tithe goes to the local church. There are ministries that I appreciate their integrity, who, when they make giving, they will say, and down at the bottom there is actually printed out, that if you send them a check, and on your check you say tithe, they will send it back to you with a letter that says your tithe goes to your local church. You support us with your offerings. That's appropriate. Bring your tithe to the storehouse. Pay where you eat. That's what God says to do. Offerings can go wherever God leads you to support other ministries. Again, the tithe is to be the first fruits. Honor the Lord with the first fruits of all of your crops. And we've read several verses. There are others in Numbers chapter 18 and Deuteronomy chapter 18, Nehemiah chapter 10, that talk about bringing the first fruits to God's house. And by the way, the truth of first fruits answers this question: how can I afford to tithe? I realized that if you became a follower of Christ later in life, this was probably one of the hardest things for you to get your head wrapped around. 10% of my income goes to the church because you aren't used to that. But it's so significant that in this passage of all of these practical truths about remembering God's law and being kind and being dependable and seeking the fear of the Lord and acknowledging God first in everything, he says, and that includes your income, that includes your finances. He doesn't leave anything out. Donna talks about, and I don't remember we actually had it in our house, but we were taught to tithe early, and Donna talks about in her house, each of the kids had a jar. That was the tithe jar. And if you got an allowance, you knew that 10% of that went into that tithe jar to take to church on Sunday. And so, if your allowance was $1, you would get some of it in dimes so that you can learn that a dime of that goes to God. And when you grow up with that, and you grow up with experiencing the blessings of that and the obedience of that, then it's not always easy, but it's easier because you've got that history. When you come to Christ later in life, this is the heart of that. I think, again, that's why Solomon puts it in here. He said, look, while you're putting God first in all your ways and trusting Him to direct your paths, that includes your finances too. Why is it that we trust God with heaven, but we won't trust Him with helping pay our bills? It's kind of an amazing thing. But it's important that we teach any young people that we have under our charge, teach them the importance of tithing, putting God first with our income. It goes to the storehouse. It's to be the first fruits. Write your tithe check first. Then it is to be with joy. 2 Chronicles chapter 9 verse 7 says, the Lord loves a cheerful giver. And the Greek word for cheerful there is the word hilaron, from which we get our word hilarious. I'm trying to remember. I don't really remember a time when I'm writing out a tithe check and I'm feeling hilarious about it, But I since, thank God, I was raised this way from infancy, basically, is, maybe I need, no, you gotta, this is first. Put God first. But we're tight this month. Put God first. When you put God first, it's amazing how the other 90% stretches. Put God first. In 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 2, he talks about the churches at Macedonia, and he said they had overwhelming joy that led to their generosity. And he said, because this is what they did, they first gave themselves to God. See, God's not after your pocketbook, He's after you. And He knows that when we surrender all to Him, that includes our finances. Lord, everything that I have is yours. My health, my strength, any mental abilities I have, it's yours. My finances, it's yours. And He just, all of it's His. He just asks for 10%. John Templeton, a financial expert, was in Atlanta several years ago addressing an Economics Incorporated meeting. And he was going through different economic theories. And when it came question and answer time, somebody stood up in the back and said, do you have any tips on the best investments to make? And he said, I sure do. He said, I can give you a risk-free guaranteed investment. He said, I learned it 46 years ago. It came from a book 2,000 years old. The first tenth of everything you have, take it to your storehouse. And beyond that, give offerings as God prospers you. And he says, I guarantee you that will be the best investment you ever make. And it is. It is. I'm not doing it this morning so you can relax, but I have in the past in churches, especially if we were going through a stewardship campaign or something, done a God's guarantee. And basically, it was a contract between the church and the individual that says, if you put God first with a minimum of 10% of your income to the church for the next 6 months, and if at the end of that time God has not kept his promise to meet your needs, we will refund your tithe. Do you know how many times? I've done that at least 3 different times in large congregations. You know how many times anybody came back to me and said, I need my money back because God's not blessing me? You know, 0. Because God keeps his promise. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. Father, that's your promise, not mine. And it's where the rubber meets the road in our lives so often. So, Father, I pray that you would help us. If we're not yet tithing, Lord, may we take that step of obedience and begin to tithe. If we're tithing, lead us into where you would like our offerings to go. Because we know that we cannot outgive you. We know that as we put you first, you direct our paths. As we put you first, you give us spiritual health and nourishment. As we put you first in our finances, you promise to meet our needs. We thank you for that. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming today. You're dismissed.